This is expecting fairness and not consistency. But consistency is all that matters. This guy really is an idiot, isn't he? Saying, I don't accept your claim. Why I say that the religious are either dumb or dishonest. The religious can be this clueless. That's not an insult, that's just an observation. It's not just them. They are either dumb or desperate to push the burden of state-funded atheism. That doesn't mean that we have a epistemic this is a problem of interpretation. That's not existent. It's the desperation for somebody else to be in the hot seat because the religious are... This guy's a real moron, isn't he?
Cool. Atheists have a burden of proof.
Another one.
To this day, it still surprises me how upset some people get just hearing that phrase.
This is just the religious desperately trying to get back to their own emotionally comforting beliefs, and nobody outside of your little cult cares. So, speaking for myself, I am not convinced that any gods exist. I'm not stating that no gods exist. I don't care if you like that. Fuck you and fuck philosophy. Okay.
Unless someone can give me a rational explanation for why that's not true, while actually understanding what I'm saying, I'm going to keep saying it.
Huh?
Anyway, someone decided to look at some of my older videos where I already explain how and why I say this and make a multi-part YouTube response series. And that's cool. For YouTube, do what you want. Throughout those videos, I noticed a pattern of inconsistencies, double standards, and shifts in how definitions are applied. And while I offered to explain or clarify offline or online, the response I got was this.
I think I've already made my position clear. I've spoken to people who have talked to you, and seriously, they describe you as irrational and unwilling to engage in discussion honestly, so pass.
Okay, so be it. Then I'll just make this response publicly for anyone watching to point out what I see going on here. And look, before we really get going, let me just say, there are 4 major problems I see, not just with this critic's response, but with how some atheists approach this topic in general. What actually counts as a claim, how people selectively apply definitions, who gets to decide what words mean, and how tone, mockery, sarcasm affects the conversation. We'll unpack each of these shortly, but first, let me restate my position clearly because a lot of the critique seems to come from misunderstanding or misrepresenting what I actually said. Anyway, again, people like watching these atheist videos, or at least click on them.
And will be eating out of the palm of my hand. Spare change. Spare change, ma'am.
Firstly, a claim is simply to contend, maintain, assert. For example, ice cream tastes bad, the world is a square, I'm unconvinced that water is wet. These are all claims because I'm asserting something as true. Burden of proof is the obligation on a party in a dispute to provide sufficient warrant for its position. And sufficient warrant is your justification or epistemic justification for a position, i.e. your reasoning. Altogether, if I assert that God exists and someone asks why or requests my epistemic justification, if I want to exchange in a discussion, I'm expected to fulfill my burden of proof. Saying goes, if I say I'm unconvinced God exists, that's still a claim. And if I'm asked why and I want to engage, I have to give reasons. That's how I explain burden of proof works, or how I explain words from my position. What reasons do you have to fulfill your burden of proof?
I don't know.
I don't know you. You think he's fictional. You think he's mean. You think God is a conspiracy by big water to get people to become weathermen. I don't know your reasons. And also, if you say you are unconvinced because there isn't enough evidence, someone could say they are convinced because there is enough evidence. This is really simple, but some individuals do not like what I'm saying. But it's fun making these, so okay. I explain this more in depth in other videos if you want to watch. Anyway, there are 4 major issues with blogs analysis that some atheists tend to make when I say atheists have a burden of proof. So I'm going to explain this and let it be the end until he makes more videos or someone else does. So now let's look at those 4 major issues in blogs analysis and why they matter. Now, I'm not trying to argue about whose definition is right or wrong. I'll get to that issue later. What I want to focus on here is whether Blog stays consistent within his own framework and whether others who use that same standard do too.
But consistency is all that matters.
So Blog dismisses my definition of claim, which is from the OED, and replaces with his own he claims from Oxford.
The noun is as follows: an assertion of the truth of something, typically one that is disputed or in doubt.
Just to let everyone know, there's a difference between the Google Oxford Languages Dictionary and the OED. That matters because sometimes people quote Oxford without realizing there are different Oxford branded sources, and those can use different wording and emphasis.
Not quite my tempo. It's all good. No worries. Here we go.
And he provides certain instances in his category.
I lack belief in X is not a claim.
In short, according to his position, only positive assertions about objective reality counts as claims, while mental states are not claims. That appears to be his standard, which is fine. You define a word however you want.
That's a 10.
You can define claim as water for who I care. But as stated before, we are not going to argue about what that means now, but testing for consistency. I'm also wondering when Blog says objective reality, what does he mean? Tangible things only? He seems to be against mental states, but saying I lack belief is still asserting something to be true about one's mental condition. Isn't that part of reality too? So this is where things get wonky. You have to,
Do I really have to do all this? Because I mean, no one's really gonna watch this far, honestly. All right, man, look. People love the atheism thing. They don't care about the whole Bible contradictions or the slavery stuff. They love the word atheist. I mean, the biblical dietary laws are coming through. But is it though? We're gonna make the video and get the clicks. And you know, we might get 2 subscribers.
okay, when stating things like,
Your proposition is false. I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm saying that you have failed to present sufficient convincing evidence for me to conclude that you're right.
and
I'm saying that you've got bad arguments that are not convincing.
according to how I define those words, you're doing what I'm asked to do with the whole epistemic justification and claim idea. But those new answers are claims, even to your standard, i.e. claiming evidence is insufficient. But he does say something that shows a very interesting position.
I don't believe in any gods, which means that I live as if no gods exist, because that is the most tenable position that I've seen. I'm not saying for sure that no gods are real, just that I see no reason whatsoever to even pretend that they do. I'm living no differently today than I would if I had never been introduced to the possibility of any gods. That's the default position after all.
The default position. If you want to define the default position as there is no X or leaving as if there is no X, that's fine. I just define the default position as more inclined as withholding judgment or leaving as there is X and no X. But we are going to argue about definitions, but look at this part right here again.
I don't believe in any gods, which means that I live as if no gods exist.
This shows a difference in his verbal claim and behavior assumption. An epistemic claim is when someone explicitly states their belief, or lack thereof, what they claim to know, think, or believe. A behavioral assumption is what someone does in practice, how they live, or what assumptions their actions imply, even if they don't say it so directly. Blog's rhetoric draws a line between those categories. He insists that his epistemic position is one of lack of conviction, not a denial. In his framework, this protects him from having to justify anything because a lack of belief is merely a psychological report, not an assertion about objective reality. Cool, but his behavioral assumption shows something different. His behavior presupposes that God does not exist. He does not live in a way that allows for or makes room for the possibility of a God. And here's the part that often gets missed. If someone were truly neutral, if they were really withholding belief, then their lifestyle will reflect both possibilities. But Blog says
That I live as if no gods exist.
that's not agnosticism, that's behavior based on the assumption that there are. Imagine a juror who says, I haven't decided if the defendant is guilty, but then votes for the conviction, mocks the defense, and punishes the accused. That's not neutrality. It's the same thing here. If your lifestyle is built around gods not existing, then functionally you made up your mind, even if your language says otherwise. It's in the disconnect between how he talks and how he lives. But wait, didn't he also say,
Words matter.
and I do agree, words
Words
matter.
matter.
So if we take his words at face value, it shouldn't be a contradiction, right?
We are saying we aren't convinced that they are. That's like me saying I'm not convinced that Bigfoot exists, but that's not saying I'm convinced that Bigfoot doesn't.
Okay, you say you don't believe, not that you believe gods don't exist, but then you live your life entirely as if they don't. That's fine if that's how you see it. Either you're inconsistent, acting on a belief you refuse to acknowledge, or you're denying a belief your actions strongly imply, which starts to look more like unresolved tension than true neutrality. And to be fair, this critique assumes believe means to assume something is true, following the Oxford language definition, the same standard you used earlier for claim. What is the standard of applying words? Why some definitions matter and others don't?
Yes, I agree. Let's do it.
Now, to ramp it up a little bit, Blog emphasized 2 points in his videos. Definitions are descriptive, not prescriptive.
Language is descriptive, not prescriptive.
And nobody gets to define someone else's label.
You don't get to tell me what I believe. If you want to know what I mean by atheism, ask me.
Which I agree on both. Somehow, some people say I don't, but it's usually a straw man on what my position is, but it is what it is. If you apply the concepts evenly, they are reasonable. But the problem is he abandons this descriptive standard principle when discussing other words like claim, burden of proof, and even my interpretation of the best way to define atheism. As stated with the OED definition of claim I was using, I even put an obviously incorrect definition on purpose. Cue Plankton.
Wait, that's not right. It should say.
But instead of recognizing it as a setup, he acted like it's my serious position. He will argue if that's my true definition at the first sighting.
That is not what that word means in this context. Seriously, I shouldn't have to explain this.
No.
And when I got to the OED definition,
And that's still wrong. It's a little less wrong.
Hey, no, stop, just calm down, don't do it.
that is a huge inconsistency. He just said that definitions reflect usage and nobody gets to dictate meaning. Yet here he ridicules me even if I was using that definition for whatever reason and double down for using a legitimate Oxford definition.
Language is descriptive, not prescriptive.
Another example is applying the academic philosophical definition of atheism, but states,
Academia, they have a lot of similar problems to the religious. They seem to think that they're an authority, and they're not. I get to define myself any damn way I please. Theism is specifically the lack of belief in gods. A is without. Theos is God. Theism is literally the lack of belief in gods. To the Greek.
you say philosophy doesn't matter, but then break down belief, mental states, and justification using philosophical categories. That comes straight out of epistemology, which again is fine when using your definitions, but are others wrong for not using the definitions they use? I just stick to the academic because it's simple, it makes sense, and all that stuff. And I can go how he dismisses my idea of how burden and proof used by his definitions, not mine. I mean, he does state,
If you want to know what I mean by atheism, ask me. Definitions are prescriptive, not descriptive. A dictionary doesn't describe what words mean. Academia, they have a lot of similar problems to the religious. They seem to think that they're an authority, and they're not. Words matter.
you can argue that definitions are just how people use words, then ridicule someone for using words differently. Either definitions are flexible or they're not. But don't insist on a descriptive standard for atheism and then enforce rigid prescriptive rules for claim, burden of proof, or philosophical terminology. You can do that, sure, but don't pretend it's consistent. It's not. Point 3. Who gets to define words? This builds directly on the last point of how definitions are applied, because now we're asking who gets to decide what they mean in the first place. Across the rebuttals, he strongly asserts this.
It doesn't matter what you think atheism should mean. It matters only what self-identified atheists say that it means to them. If you want to know what I mean by atheism, ask me. Atheism is literally the lack of belief in gods. To the Greek. This is something that I see all the time. Who knows if he's going to go there?
He asserts nobody can define atheism for him. Philosophical or academic authorities are irrelevant. Only individual self-identification matters. Honestly, this is a fair stance if you apply it consistently, but he doesn't, and that's where the issue lies. For example, I use the OED definition of claim. His responses are,
That is not what that word means in this context. And that's still wrong. It's a little less wrong, I guess. This guy really is an idiot, isn't he?
that's inconsistent.
But consistency is all that matters.
If words mean what people use them to mean, then mocking someone for quoting a dictionary definition because it's not your usage doesn't line up. Another example, if using his definition of burden of proof,
You're the only one that's misunderstanding stuff, not me. Why? Because he's got a vested interest in shifting the burden of proof, and that is not how this works. I have zero burden at all if I do not make a positive claim. Gods. Repeating your own demonstrably wrong position over and over and over again doesn't make that position right.
Yeah, boy.
another inconsistency. He says everyone defines words for themselves except when it comes to me. And suddenly, burden of proof has to mean his version only, Even with atheism, he insists.
You're not going to find a lot of atheists who give a damn about the philosophical definition.
Honestly, I say lack theism is popular definition as online, but in real life, it's not always the same. Anybody got stats on that? He rejects academic definitions as prescriptive, but then uses linguistic roots as prescriptive when it supports his position. That's a textbook example of selective standards. This is actually a good moment to bring up my use of the words may and do when talking about burden of proof. I say that atheists may have a burden when they make a claim. And once they do make that claim, they do have a burden. Simple as that. The may is about possibility, and the do is about actual engagement. But instead of asking what I mean by that, as he insists people should do when talking about atheism, he criticized it without clarification. If it's confusing, I'll switch to always saying may just to make things simpler. Blog says definitions are based on uses, and no one can tell someone else what label to use, except when I do it. Then suddenly definitions have one correct form. You say definitions depend on uses, fine. Let me use mine the same way you are using yours. That's not about being right, but about being consistent. Point 4. Tone, mockery, and what does that achieve? To be clear, I'm not saying you hurt my feelings. I'm not saying you can't make jokes. I mean, I made some bland jokes here and there.
You serious?
Well, duh.
This is for everyone. He is Christian, agnostic, Muslim, whomever. When you position yourself driven by evidence, he repeatedly says,
That's because I only care about the truth.
these are admirable values, and I actually respect them. But say things like direct insults and name calling,
This guy really is an idiot, isn't he?
sarcasm and sneering tone,
How the religious can be this clueless, and to be fair,
projection of desperation and dishonesty.
just because you are desperate to push the burden of proof onto atheists,
Even if your arguments have merit, the tone does real damage. And let me be clear, obviously, I don't have an issue with attacking the argument. I have no issue with jokes, laughter, stuff of that nature. But when you attempt to attack the person, you create hostility without progress. It creates hostility instead of dialogue, replaces argument with ridicule, assumes your opponent's motive without evidence, undermines the very standards you claim to uphold. You say you care about logic and truth, but mockery makes it harder for people to even hear your point, let alone consider it. I am guilty of this too. This is especially important when he criticized me for being desperate, goalpost moving, dishonest, or fanatical without demonstrating these traits. Do you expect someone to change? I literally get called demon-possessed from other Christians. Do you actually expect someone to change their mind through that mockery? I mean, I know I don't. So if that doesn't move me, what would sarcasm from anyone do? There is a difference in attacking a person versus the argument. And if I do it, call me out on it. Because if this is really about rational discourse evidence, why replace argument with ridicule? If your logic stands on its own, you don't need to call people idiots or laugh at sincerity. You can disagree without the meaning. But when insults replace analysis, it tells me that you're not here to win arguments, you're just here trying to win the room. So yeah, that's it. I lay out my 4 main issues I see with blog response: inconsistent definitions, double standards on who gets to define words, shifting what counts as a claim, and a tone that undercuts the very values he says he stands for. I'm not here to convince